I'm going to go on the end because I just trigger comment. Yeah. Okay, let's go. Hello, everyone. Now stand up, makes it easier. Hello, everyone. Shh. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. And I hope you've enjoyed your tea. It looks totally delicious from up here, and I haven't managed anything. So, I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you've had a lovely time out there with our 4 wonderful authors. And I just want to mention something about the books. We had a rather peculiar order from Bertram's this morning. So all the books are there, but they're in very odd sort of numbers. So we have no idea whether they're going to sell out or whether we're going to end up with 3,000 of one copy at the end of the day. If we sell out of something, please give us your name and address, and we will arrange for that book to be signed by one of the authors and sent on to you. And that's courtesy of us. We'll happily do that. The other thing to say is that Kathy's latest book has been delivered to us in hardback, The Boy Who Fell to Earth, which is a wonderful novel, and so therefore that's their mistake, not ours, so we're going to sell it to you at the paperback price because it is just out in paperback, and I really don't see why you should pay hardback for a book a hardback price. So I just want you to know that, and the bookshop know that out there too. No, it's the least we can do. So it just gives me great pleasure to introduce 2 masters, or should I say mistresses, of the art of storytelling. They are 2 just sublime writers. Wendy Holden worked as a journalist on the Sunday Times, Tatler, and the Mail on Sunday, our own dear
You magazine.
On You magazine.
Yeah. You taught me everything I know about everything.
No, don't worry.
Sorry.
Before she became a full-time novelist, she left for full-time work, and she has written 10 consecutive Sunday Times top 10 bestsellers, which is quite an achievement, including Simply Divine, Fame Fatale, great title, and The School for Husbands. And her latest book is called Gifted and Talented. Kathy Lett has written 10 comic novels, which, as she says on her website, speak to women in the way that we do when men are not around. She left school at 16, wrote her first novel, amazingly, when she was 17, and it was called, quite rightly, Puberty Blues. And since then, her novels, such as Mad Cows, How to Kill Your Husband, and Other Handy Hints, and To Love, Honor, and Betray, have been international bestsellers. And her latest book, The Boy Who Fell to Earth, has just been published in paperback, as I said, and is an absolute cracker of a read. I loved it.
Thank you.
It's so painfully honest about a single mother with an Asperger's son. So I wanted you to tell me all about it. This is quite personal for you, isn't it?
Oh, well, I only write because it's cheaper than therapy. And, I've just cannibalized my whole life up until this point. And I am quite candid. Australians are, we strip off to our emotional underwear in 3.6 seconds, and it's a psychological striptease that reveals all. And women do, don't we, when we're together? We're very candid and self-deprecating. But the one thing I'd never talked about was the fact that I have a son on the autistic spectrum. I don't know whether anybody here does. You might, and you might just not be diagnosed, or your husband might be. If you've got a husband who's a train spotter and a plane spotter, or alphabetizes his music and is a bit emotionally inarticulate, and there's a chance that he might be on the spectrum and undiagnosed. But when I was writing actually my 12th novel, I think, and I was going to write a satire on the sex war, and then I started writing these other books, started pouring out of my pen about a single mother raising a child on the autistic spectrum. I thought, oh gosh, this is the autobiographical book I thought might erupt one day. And I thought, but I won't tell anyone. I'll publish the book and I'll let it stand on its own 2 literary legs, and I won't admit that it's my child, because I didn't want to invade his privacy. But then a journalist asked me, was it true that I had a child with autism? And I thought, well, I'm not going to lie. If I lie, it looks like I'm embarrassed of him. And, of course, the opposite is true. I'm so proud of him. And he was 21 then, so I asked him what he thought. And he read the book, and he said, well, Mum, it's a celebration of idiosyncrasies, eccentricities, and being different. Yeah, it is. So with his permission, I very tentatively came out about it. And I was really nervous, I must say, in a way I've never been before, but I'm so glad I did. First of all, because every day I get letters from other parents saying, you know, thank you for putting into words what their lives are like. And also it was so cathartic. Because also now people understand why I'm so deranged. I'm always swinging off a chandelier and drinking champagne and going mad because it's so stressful having a child on the spectrum like that.
You write a lot about the stress and the sense of guilt that Lucy feels about the fact that maybe it's something that she did, that this child is so, you know, is so complicated and challenging. But also the devotion between Lucy and Merlin is really, really powerful, I thought. And then there's just the challenge and the social isolation. Is that all?
Yeah, I tried to make it funny too, because it is hilarious having a child. No, if you know anyone on the spectrum, they have, what it means is if you're on the spectrum, it means you have a lifelong neurological disability, really, that means you're not very good at social situations, you probably have chronic OCD and anxiety or whatever, but you're also often incredibly smart. And my own son is Wikipedia with a pulse. He's so clever. But they also have no filter, so they say whatever they're thinking, which means that socially you sweat more than Paris Hilton doing a Sudoku because you never know what he's going to say. Like, once I took him to Downing Street years ago to meet Tony Blair. It was a charity function. I said, oh, Jules, I guess Jules was 13 or something. I said, this is Tony Blair and the Prime Minister. And he said, oh, yes, you're the one my mother calls Tony blah, blah, blah. And I'm going... And then I took him to some other function where he met Anne Whitaker. He said to her, oh, yes, you're someone my mum says is two-faced. But if so, why are you wearing that one when it's all wrinkly and crinkly and old? And you just think, oh, just shoot me. There's no way to go. So I tried to make the book really as funny as I could. And also it's a love story. It's a romance. So that, you know, the Asperger's and all that is woven underneath. The main story is between the mother looking for romance.
But and that's where you get incredible gags and humour going through it. The hilarity is that the single mother, you know, she's been on her own, the husband walks out because the child is Asperger's.
Which happens all the time, I hasten to add,
And then there she is 6 years without, is it 6 years, something like that, without, you know, she's so exhausted looking after this child that, you know, she begins to sort of try and date again. But of course, every date has a problem because Merlin
accidentally sabotages.
And so it's a terrific vehicle, I thought, for...
Well, it's fun too when you're writing about something so personal. Normally, if you're researching a book, you have to go down the Amazon or up Everest, and I just go knock on his bedroom door and say, "Jules, what would you say right now?" You know. So that was quite good.
But I think it's a does it feel like a departure for you in that this is actually something? You know, your novels are full of humour and gags and puns, and they're brilliant in that way. But this is the first one that sort of.
Oh yeah, I definitely dipped the pen in the artery and wrote from there. But I think that's how, the way women survive with each other. I always think women are each other's human wonder bras, uplifting, supportive, and making each other look bigger and better, don't you think? And that sense of girl talk and camaraderie and being honest with each other. I mean, I think that's what keeps us buoyant. And, you know, as women, we have so much to put up with in life, don't we? I mean, from period cramps to pregnancy and then to childbirth where you stretch your vagina the customary 5 kilometres, and then, you know, menopause, and then just when everything goes quiet, do you know what happens? You grow a beard. How can that be fair in any way? So I think if we didn't have the ability to laugh about things and be honest with each other, I think we probably would, you know, go under. So I just tried to use that same sense of humour in the book, but there is a darker undercurrent running through it.
Definitely. But also this really powerful bond. I don't think I've read ever quite such a powerful bond between mother and son as this.
Well, when you get the diagnosis, Jules was 3 when we got the diagnosis, and it's like the word autism just drags you down into the dark. I mean, that's just the most awful word you could possibly be told when you have a child. And as your first instinct as a mother, this lioness type love comes out of you, where you just think it's your job to protect him. He was like a little wilting plant in a gloomy room, and I just thought, I'm going to drag him into the light, and you get so protective. And of course, as you're saying, first of all, you go into denial, and then you bankrupt yourself seeing every medical expert on the planet. You know, I hate to think how many doctors' children I've now put through university, and then you, as a mother, your guilt gland throbs terribly, because you think, was it something I ate, something I drank, was it that one glass of wine in the final trimester? You know, if only I'd feng shuied my aura like Gwyneth Paltrow and Organic Co, you know, all would be fine. And then you do get an attack of the old why me's for a while, which is a bit pathetic. And then eventually you start to think, well, you know what, this is the little person I've been given, and I just have to do my best by them. And I no longer think there's any such thing as normal and abnormal. I think there's ordinary and extraordinary. And I think people on the autistic spectrum are quite exceptional. I mean, with diagnostic hindsight, we now know that, you know, Mozart and Einstein and Orwell and Warhol and all these fascinating people were probably on the autistic spectrum. So with the right help, they could give back to the community in the most amazing way. But unfortunately, they often end up living in a bedsit on benefits. So I wrote the book to try and help take the stigma away and just make people a little bit more accepting of people who are different. But there's a lot of sad times. I remember he came home from school once when he was about 9 with a sign on his back saying, "Kick me, I'm a retard."
Oh, no, David Copperfield.
And you could have just taken my heart out and thrown it on the floor and jumped on it. You know, he's got tears in his eyes saying, "Mum, am I a retard? What is a retard?" I mean, all that kind of stuff will break your heart. But as I said, the positive side, I wanted to really emphasize that too, how unique these people are, because they have a sort of tangential, literal logic that's quite exceptional. You know, like when everyone was telling me he was retarded, my son was retarded and he was never going to make his way in the world. When he stopped talking, but when he did start talking at about 4, he kept asking me the most interesting questions. You know, he came into the kitchen one night and I was chopping onions and he said, "Mum, if onions make you cry, are there vegetables that make you happy?" I thought, what a great question.
Well, that's a great question.
Amazing questions for a child.
That's what they're like.
All
He said to
vegetables
me,
are hell.
Yeah, exactly. He said to me one day, you know, Mum, what's the speed of dark? You know, every day he's saying these fascinating things. So.
And
Yes.
did you write them all down? Did you have a notebook then at the time? Or
I
did
did a lot. I did sort of jot things down quite a lot, yes. So I did have a kind of resource when I finally came to write the book. And the other thing I'd say is that even though it's been really hard, and it's like, you sometimes feel I didn't give birth to him, but I found him under a spaceship and I'm raising him as my own. There's no owner's manual. I do think he's made me into a better person, because he's made me less judgmental and more compassionate. So, you know, there is a positive side to all of that as well. Yeah.
Brilliant. So Wendy, now let's come on to your novel, your lovely novel, Gifted and Talented. I curled up in bed with it and I just couldn't finish it. Couldn't sort of not finish it. I had to finish it.
You have to finish it.
I have to finish it.
You have to talk about it.
No, I wanted to finish it. I wanted to find out whether a happy or a sad ending. I was devastated for Diana, who is another single mother. So you've both got single mothers.
Yeah.
What was the genesis of this particular book?
This particular book, well, it's sort of slightly silly genesis, I suppose. I don't know how many of you out here are probably once a year are harassed by your former place of higher education, ringing you up for money. But once a year I get calls from my old college, my old Cambridge college, wanting money basically, and and they sort of ring up and you talk to a student who tells you about what life is like there now. And at first I wasn't really all that interested, because I didn't really. It was so long ago, and then I just thought, well, actually, this could be quite fun, because actually these people are ringing up all sorts of people like me who are taking the phone calls at different times of day and doing different things, and it's really quite interesting. So I asked the person ringing me, who happened to be called Craig, so Craig, what happens when you ring up people like me? What do they say to you? And I said, oh, well, it's a bit mixed. I suppose the worst one I got was the man who said, "What room are you in?" And it turned out that Craig was in the room that this bloke had formerly had, which was obviously great. And then he said, "Has it still got that stain on the wall?" I said, "What stain?" It might have. Why? I said, "I made that stain." Oh. Well, it could have been coffee. It could have been coffee. I don't know what the stain was, but it was sort of. And then there were other examples of things. So people leaving really quite strange mobile phone, answering phone messages saying things like, please leave us a message. We're all so miserable. Mummy can't cook, and Daddy's gone away, and it's also sort of strange sort of insights into people's lives. And then one very grand old lady who was titled, who said, "Do you realise it's Saturday afternoon, young man?" and slammed the phone down. So I just thought, this is quite funny. And so it started from there, this idea that it was a slightly struggling college that needed money. It wasn't one of the more glamorous ones, and that needed money, and so all the students had to ring people up. So that was the kind of genesis of it, really. But it got me thinking about my my own life as a student, and actually, even though starting university is very exciting in lots of ways, it's also quite funny, and it's full of banana skins and full of things going wrong and things not quite working out the way you expect. And also because a university is full of young people, all let off the leash for the first time, it just seemed to be the natural theatre for a romance and a comedy. And of course you have people of all kinds of different ages. You have the lecturers, and you have the people who were service to college, the gardeners, with Diana being one of the gardeners, and the master of the college who's at the other end of the spectrum, sort of right at the top of the tree there. So it just seemed, and also an area that people didn't really seem to have explored recently. I mean, of course, in the 60s and 70s, there were so many campus novels that they seem to have died out, and which is strange because so many more people go to university now. So it just seemed to be a sort of natural opportunity, and I was
it's brilliant. I loved all that, because you say you went to Cambridge, but it felt to me like it's a sort of modelled on Oxford. Am I right? Because you were referring to. I mean, you don't ever say. What town it is.
I was trying to be quite careful.
Feels
about, I didn't want to upset my old college in case they thought I was being horrible about them.
References to the Bullington Club.
Exactly. This is sort of evil. Yeah, my heroine falls foul of the evil. Exactly.
But also you've kind of
Bollinger Club.
Bollinger, that's right. Yeah.
Well, I call it the Bollinger Club. I can't remember.
You call it something.
I think it mixes it all up in a way that no one could possibly recognise.
But I thought it was incredibly good and astute on the kind of new idea of the haves and have-nots in that kind of very privileged university.
Yeah, and I think that must be worse actually now. It must be, because it seems that I was at university in the 80s, at Cambridge in the 1980s, and in many ways my time there is. It's quite funny because I came from a very ordinary background and went to Cambridge as the first of my family to go to university, anywhere like that. And I was completely full of ideas about Brideshead Revisited and all the rest of it. I thought the streets would be full of people in bull-nosed Morrises who looked like Sebastian Flight, and of course it wasn't like that at all. And that was a real disappointment to me. And also, most of the people who were very upmarket spent their whole time trying to pretend that they were actually very ordinary indeed. And the sort of the reversal became complete when I ended up on marches for the miners, supporting the miners. And I was thinking, I came to Cambridge to get away from the miners, not get out and support, because I come from Yorkshire and it was all miners and all strikes, and I just wanted to get away from all that. But no, I was out there again marching for the miners. So. It was all sort of not quite the way I'd expected it, but very funny, and funnier in retrospect.
But you've got this wononderful character, Amber Piggott, is she right?
Yes. She's a kind of
it girl socialite who somehow manages to get there, to use it as a sort of.
Yes, exactly. Well, I think there are probably more of that type of student around. I mean, you do see, I suppose another reason for wanting to write a campus comedy was, it's quite unusual. I mean, at least once a month you'll see some story about the boat club or the some other club sort of posing naked for a calendar or whatever, and it just seems there's so much more sort of salacious goings on, and probably quite sort of regressive and not very. I mean, when I was there, it was all very sort of feminist and politically correct, but it seems to have slightly gone backwards. But that means that there's more scope for comedy, I suppose, because you get these sort of very extreme situations between people who, the haves and the have-nots, and also, just people just behaving much worse, I suppose, which is also makes things more amusing. But yes, Amber Piggott, I wanted to have an it girl. I wanted to have a sort of, because that was really the way I began writing in the first place, and I like writing about people like that. Tara Palmer Tomkinson was my first, I suppose she was the reason I started writing, because I went to work for the Sunday Times and ended up ghosting her column. And she became extremely, I know Liz did later on, we're both veterans of this great school. These people, it was a great story because I got to live that life, but I could also see that it wasn't really all that much fun. And, in the end, it was a great launch pad, because I was able to take the the training that writing that column week in, week out had given me, because it was almost like writing a novel, 600 words a week, and just that was my first novel. So I've always sort of liked that sort of character.
Yes, because I felt reading it, because I know you, I felt reading that Isabel, who is the main wonderful character who comes down from Scotland, who has to do the essays for Amber Piggott.
Yes, she does. Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
I thought, but Wendy used to do those columns.
Exactly.
Like, she knows what that feels like.
Exactly, I mean, I'm sure there probably are people who get blackmailed into writing people's essays.
Yes,
yes,
I'm sure they buy them now, don't they?
I'm sure they do. Yeah, it's just so difficult now with
No, I thought that was really, really powerful. I mean, were there things about Oxford or Cambridge, Oxbridge, that you felt you couldn't put in there, or was there anything that you held back?
I didn't want to do anything that would upset anybody. I know that, because I'm still fairly, I get on quite well with the people that run my own college, because even though this is how it all began with the ringing up for money, but I do go back and I do give talks and things like that, so I didn't want to upset them. But I did, what I wanted also to have a bit of fun with was that in any of these universities, these old universities, you have old buildings and new buildings, old colleges and new colleges, and the very new colleges are usually extreme 70s nightmares with kind of concrete dining halls whose roofs slide back, although they don't anymore because they jammed sometime in 1975, but things like that. And I just love bad architecture and really terrible looking buildings because they're so funny. And of course, in a university like that, the people who are at those colleges in those terrible buildings with the kind of concrete walls in their bedrooms and the sort of concrete floors and concrete everything are very much looked down on by the ones who are in the,
in the old buildings.
Tudor ones. So there's all this sort of snobbery that goes on inside. And I just wanted to have some fun with that. And I thought it was more
interesting.
fun.
Yeah, it's interesting because both of you have written quite personal novels in a funny sort of way. And I wondered how easy it is to set the boundary, where that boundary lies between fiction, in inverted commas, and putting yourself in it. I mean, is it?
Well, for me, it was quite a long time ago, so it's probably easier for me than for Cathy, because obviously Cathy's son is still quite young, and it was an awfully long time ago for me, since I was in that situation, like 20 years, obviously about sort of 10 years.
I thought it was the easiest book I'd ever written, because it just could flow. It was so autobiographical. But of course, now I've run out of material. I've told my husband I have to have an affair to get some more material. He thinks he should have the affair because it would give me more angst, and hence a better book. We're currently negotiating. By the way, you know who my husband was engaged to when I met him?
Nigella.
Yes.
He was. Did you know that? Did you know that? Kat?
No, I did not know that.
Wait.
I hope nobody's tweeting this.
He broke up with her for me, and I can't cook. Nothing. I use my smoke alarm as a timer. I think he regrets it now.
I'm sure he doesn't.
I bet he does.
The other thing I wanted to ask, and before I throw it open to the audience, because I'm sure you've got lots of questions, and if you haven't, don't worry, because I will, is comedy. You're both really brilliant at comedy, at gags that make you laugh.
No.
I mean, do you both lie in the bath all night, dreaming them up?
No, but it's funny you should
or do they just come like that? I mean,
but the bath is a really good place to think up jokes, and particularly titles. I find that lying in the bath, some of my best ideas have come to me.
Right.
And maybe it's the early morning, and maybe it's the warmth of the water. I don't know, but the bath is always a.
God, but my bath would be ice cold.
No,
I had a single idea.
No.
What about you, Kevin?
Well, gosh, I think women. It's a great male myth that women aren't funny. I mean, when you go on a girls' night out, don't you have to be hospitalised from hilarity? And yet, wherever I go on book tour in the world, people say, women aren't really funny. I think men say that because they're terrified what it is we're being funny about. I think they think we spend the entire time talking about the length of their members, which is not true, because we also talk about the width, which after childbirth is so much more important. But so I just think it's a natural way for women to relate to each other. And also we know that women use about 350 or 400 words extra in our vocabulary every day compared to men. We are more verbally dexterous. And we're not as physically strong as men, but we can annihilate with a one-liner. I call it having a black belt in tongue fu. That you can shoot a one-liner at a guy and you can kind of comedically kneecap him. And I think it's a skill women do have, and so I just put that down on paper, just as you said before. The way
but
women
most of
talk
us
is no men.
sort of, you may think that, but we don't dare vocalize it, but you seem to be able to. I mean, or would you disagree with me? I don't know. I sort of feel I can think about all sorts of awful things I'd love to say, but I wouldn't think to sort of write them down or say them or but you do, which is both of you, which is brilliant.
Oh, well, thank you.
Has anybody else got questions? Yes.
Kathy, can you
Do we have a mic?
I arrived here about 7 years ago with 6 children, and my kids were involved enrolled.
Do you want to just start the question again so everybody can hear?
I arrived in England 7 years ago from Sydney with 6 children, which includes a set of twins and triplets. Oh, so I know they're weapons.
Applause for that woman.
It's commiseration. They're weapons of mass destruction, but we'll leave that for another time. But we turned up at the prep school, and I can remember all the parents sitting around telling me that this one's going to Oxford and this one's going to Cambridge, and it came my turn, and I said, mine all came out the wrong hole. So there was dead silence, and my oldest daughter looked at me and said, Mum, that isn't funny, you're embarrassing them, which is getting to my question. How much Australian humour do you infuse into your characters, and how do you have to turn that, sort of tune it down to match your audience, or do you just remain the wonderful Kathy Lett that we've known and loved for years?
Well, I'll tell you what, being Australian means you can get away with a lot in England because people just think, oh, she's Antipodean, she can't help it, For example, a couple of years ago, I went to the Royal Polo. A friend was taking me, and Clarence House saw that my name was there on the Royal Polo, and they rang me up and said, as you're coming to the polo, would you like to present the cups to the princes? Obviously, they were very low on any celebs that day. So I was like, oh, okay. So I go to the Royal Polo, I'm standing next to the organiser, and Wills and Harry are over there. And I said to the guy, well, what do I do? And he said, well, as they approach, you kiss them on the cheek, and then you present the cup. And it was a very formal, stuffy event, and Prince William was walking towards me, and I could see he looked so bored. So I said to him, apparently, I have to kiss you. Do you want tongue? And Prince William goes, oh, perhaps later. And then he went back and told Harry, and Harry's killing himself. I could see him laughing. And he came over to me, and I said, do you want tongue? And he goes, oh, yeah! He picked me up, and I rode him around the paddock and everything. And normally, if any of you did that, you'd be in the tower, wouldn't you? But they just think, oh, poor little colonial.
You rode Prince Harry around the paddock?
Yeah, well, I've got photos. We're snogging, laughing.
Just to make sure.
It was hysterically funny, and everybody was on the floor laughing. So you can play that to your advantage.
And this could be the affair. This could be the affair that you were talking about.
Well, I did feel a frisson.
Yeah.
And I thought he's still single. Imagine being married to the monarch and being on the stamp, getting licked all day. That's what I call job satisfaction.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Did that answer your question? Okay, any more questions? Yeah, there's one over there. We've got a mic. Thank you, Jill.
It's another question for Kathy. You made me think what you were saying about people like Mozart and Einstein, and, and they probably, did you say they probably were?
Yeah, that's what
right.
Psychologists diagnosed that was probably, some of them had bipolar, but a lot of them would have been autistic, yeah.
Now that's interesting that you say bipolar, because it just made me think that although obviously there's once you're diagnosed as having autism, then you can get you supported and helped.
Yes.
But it also made me think, do you think once you're given a label, if you like, is there a downside to that? Because I was just thinking of, my son is bipolar, but it almost seemed that once he was given that diagnosis, he kind of not performed, obviously he didn't perform, but it was almost as if he was given the permission then to be a bipolar. So do you think there's a downside to having, a label and, it stigmatizes as well as gets you that support?
I think the only reason to get a label, it signposts you in the right direction to get the right help, that's all. So, because once you do have a label, you can get a little government support, for various things, a bit of extra help at schooling, whatever. But all of these kids, they're not just one thing. It's all like they have a kind of minestrone of different disabilities and problems, and it's just an umbrella word, Asperger's or autism or bipolar or whatever. But I don't believe you should just pigeonhole people, no. But it is, as I said, it's just, you know, if your son is behaving erratically, or my son is, and you say to people, oh, look, he's bipolar or he's got Asperger's, people then go, oh, okay, and they're more understanding and they're more accepting. And what was that terrific film that came out about bipolar, you know, last year? What was that great film? A songbook. Silver Songbook Lining.
Oh, yeah. Silver Linings Playbook.
Well, say it again?
Silver Linings Playbook.
Yes, when they make films where the protagonists have problems like that, it's so important because it makes people just be that little bit more compassionate and not so judgmental. So, you know, bipolar now, we weren't even talking about it 5 years ago. Then Stephen Fry admitted that he has it, and various other people have spoken about it. So it can only be a good thing. I think as writers, it's always good to shine a light into a dark place. It can only make things better. But the labelling, yeah, just as a little crutch, I think it is a good idea. But we can talk later. Yeah.
Any other questions?
That was a serious note. We better have something frivolous now.
Well, yeah. Well, on the Stephen Fry note, and then we could talk a little bit about writing, actually, I thought might be interesting for people who are writing here in the audience. But on your website, Kathy, you say that one of your career highlights was teaching Stephen Fry a word he didn't know. And I'm desperate to know what that word could be.
I know, that's the only thing on my CV, isn't it? Stephen Fry word. Misogynist.
Oh, what does
and
that
it
mean?
means an allergy to marriage.
Misogynist?
Misogynist, yes.
M-I-S-T.
Misogynist, not misogynist.
Not misogynist.
Mist. Yeah.
An allergy to marriage.
Yeah.
Oh, how
Okay.
interesting.
But I also taught Salmon Rush to the Limbo.
Okay.
That's on my CV. And I must have done something else of any interest, did I?
No. It's just I wanted to know what the word was. You tantalisingly didn't put it on.
Yeah.
Okay, now what about writing? Because I know lots of people probably here are writing themselves. I mean, let's talk a little bit about plot and structure. I mean, how do you go about it? You talked about having your idea about alumni.
Yes, I think that's right. I think it's
how does it go from there?
Yeah. So, well, in my case, you come up with a scenario like that, and then you have to get opposites. I mean, if you're writing comic novels, you need to get opposites just to fire off each other because it's all about contrast. So and sort of social extremes, and so you sort of start to plot, you know, those things out, and it sort of really goes from there. Sort of, you know.
But you make it sound so easy. But I mean, do you sort of, you know, put a notebook for one person? I mean, how do you develop it?
Well, a notebook's a difficult thing actually because I have notebooks everywhere and I write in everything, in the backs of books,
me
train
too.
tickets,
Yeah.
and you inevitably lose them. And actually, a really toe-curling exchange I heard in the playground this week involving one mother discovering a really hideous-sounding website on her child's iPhone, which had the most ghastly title, but was really funny because the degree of irresponsibility surrounding the whole thing was so sort of epic that I wrote down the whole exchange. And then last night, I left the whole thing in a pub. And I just imagine the landlady sort of opening and just reading this and thinking, this woman, she sits there with her daughter last night playing cards and her husband looking as if the butter wouldn't melt and she's writing all this. So it's a bit, so, you know, so you have to be quite careful where you put your notebooks down. But yeah, I mean, I used to be quite organised about that, but now I'm really quite sort of hopeless. And so, but that's what I do, because if you can't, you think I will remember this, but you never do.
You have to write
so
it.
every night I open novels and I find notes in the back and I can't read my writing and I think, well, this one. But generally, that's the way to do it.
But the good thing is that everything's material, so and people can't hurt you. Because even if someone says something nasty to you, you know, like when I first came to England, I could tell you who it was. Maybe if we're going on live streaming, I better not. A famous British literary lioness was putting me down in that very English way. Because I mean, when I first arrived here, because Jeff had been with Nigella, all the newspapers were saying, how could good-looking, gorgeous, handsome, brilliant QC break up with gorgeous, fabulous domestic goddess and daughter of the Chancellor of the Exchequer for loudmouth colonial nymphomaniac? And I'm like, how dare they call me a loudmouth? Please, you know. But this literary lioness once said to me, English, like, you can be the Navratilovas of the backhanded compliment. You know, you can put someone down in a night smiling, you know, while you're doing it. And she said to me, oh, it's just so awkward being so beautiful. She said, men underestimate my intelligence. She said, I wish I could make myself less attractive. Then she looked me up and sat down and said, so tell me, Kathy, how do you do it? Now, normally that would hurt you, but I just said, thank you, that's a fabulous line of dialogue, and I just wrote it straight down and put it straight into a novel. So,
And did it go into a novel?
It did. Went into Fetal Attraction.
Oh,
yes,
right.
it did.
Oh, God, it would be wonderful to know if she read it, and if she knew and recognised it, or would probably forget.
I had a similar one. Somebody turning up at work with some shoes once, and my boss saying to me, "Oh yes, my wife looked at those at the weekend. They look cheap and nasty on her, but they suit you." Actually, that went into the back of my first novel. That was actually there on the back. Yeah,
It's just a great line,
I know,
isn't
exactly.
it? Yeah.
But it's true. But actually, the problem with that sort of thing is that you can use it occasionally, but and other times somebody says something nasty, you think, right, I'm going to really put you in a boat, but often you just completely don't.
Oh, but you can impale enemies on the end of your pen
you have to get
too.
around to that bit of your boat, don't you? And by the time it comes around, you've forgotten.
Poetic justice, the only true justice in the world. I said that married to a lawyer.
Yeah.
No, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think people always underestimate. I think we're very trusting with fiction, aren't we? We want to be told a story. This is a story, and therefore it must all be made up, and it comes from someone's imagination. And I think often we don't realise kind of how much fiction there is in fact, because people don't really know what happened, and they make it up, and how much non-fiction there is in fiction. Is that so?
I think so. I mean, I find actually that the people who think they're in your book normally aren't, and the people who are don't really recognise themselves.
Yes,
particularly if they're a really ghastly character. You know, it's often people who are. I mean, I remember that my first book, Simply Divine, I had a character in it who was based on someone I used to work with. He was a really nice bloke, but he appeared in this book with sweaty hands, and he was so angry about the sweaty hands. It was just kind of incidental detail. And probably one day in the book when it was just really, really hard, but he was so angry about it, and it was such a tiny thing compared to all the other awful things that people in the book were.
But do people recognise themselves when it's not them? Because of course, when you're writing about a human being, you're writing about the human condition, aren't you, and humanity. And so
that's what you say to these people. That's what you say to them, Kate. But they say, no, that's me. I'm never speaking to you again.
But you can have great revenge. I've just I've got a baddie in my new novel I've just handed in, and of course I turned him into Chris Grayling, and I've sent him to prison where there's nothing to read in his cell.
Yeah.
You know, so you can actually kind of.
That wouldn't worry Chris Grayling, I don't think.
I sent him a book the other day. I sent him The Great Escape. I thought that might be what. And so yeah, you can have a lot of revenge. Yeah. But also fiction. Life is stranger than fiction. I mean, you know,
isn't it?
The woman who's just
Really?
got engaged to George Clooney, Amal. She's my husband's junior, and she works at his chambers. Now, if I put that in a novel, a human rights lawyer meets the world's most famous bachelor, and off they go. You know, you'd be pilloried by the critics, but it does actually always happen. You know that when I wrote sitcom in LA, I gave George Clooney his first job. Did you know that? I cast him in a show called The Facts of Life. I did. Well, but I'd forgotten about it because he had big sideburns and he was a bit, he wasn't
geeky.
Yeah, he was a bit geeky. And then years later, I'd moved to London, had 2 children, I was at home, and one of my writer friends was visiting me from LA, and ER was on the background, and he said to me, I was saying, look at that Dr. Ross, isn't he gorgeous? You know, I could swim through a pool of my own drool to get to him. He said, but that's the guy you cast. That's George. That's George Clooney. I went, ah! I lay in the corner and cried and sobbed because actually, when we were in LA, he did ask me on a date, and I said no. I said, I'm a writer. I don't go an actor. You put other people's words in your mouth, and you never know where they've been. You know. So I'm totally regretting it now.
Anybody feel the burning urge? We've got about 5 more minutes. So, okay, so what about plot? Do you have the end game at the end? Do you know where it's going to go, or are you finding your way as you write?
Sometimes. I mean, it's a really good idea if you're writing a novel to have a vague idea of where the plot's going. When I first started, I didn't used to do that, and you waste an awful lot of time going up various blind alleys. But it's true that once you get going, even though you've got this predestined path, sometimes it does go off in interesting ways, and I find that's quite a relief, really.
A relief. And then do you sort of think, I shouldn't have gone down that path? Because, it must be quite hard to sort of stray, when you stray off.
I think the really difficult thing with comedy, the thing that you absolutely must remember is that you're trying to entertain. It's about entertaining other people, and you must really resist the temptation to sort of stop banging drums about things that are very sort of serious and, that maybe quite personal, because you need to keep it sort of quite, well, not general, but just keep it light. In my case, anyway, just keep it light, keep it entertaining, because the point of my books is I just want people to enjoy reading them and have fun and be amused. So, but sometimes, and I see this because I review quite a lot of books as well, and you can see where somebody started off really well, and then they may veer off into some fairly sort of complicated, sort of dark area, and they've completely gone off and they can't get back on track again. And I find that's because comedy, it seems like a really easy thing to do, but it's actually quite difficult, isn't it, Kathy? It's really hard. It's hard to keep it funny. So yeah, keep it light and keep it funny.
And yet they only ever give prizes to turgid books.
Oh, don't they just?
Ghost or road in the title.
Yeah. Or the something. Yeah.
Why is that? Why is comedy so sort of...
Look down, because I don't know. It didn't used to be, but it is now.
Somebody think about Evelyn Waugh, hilarious.
Well, I know.
There's sort of, we have a tradition, actually, of English literature, which is...
Oh, particularly with women. I mean, incredible women writers.
Yeah.
All the best writers, Stella Gibbons, Richmond Crompton, Nancy Mitford. I mean, there's an amazing British tradition of really funny women writers. But yeah, particularly lately, comedy in general is not. I don't think it's celebrated as it should be, really, or even encouraged as it should be. But you do get quite a lot of very, very serious, very boring, long books.
And I think a lot of the critics have been at Oxford for so long, they've got ivy growing up the backs of their legs.
Exactly.
And what they graduated in was advanced condescension and smuggery. So it's partly that they have to show how intelligent they are
Yeah, it's true. And yet we have this amazing tradition of comedy on television, which is phenomenal. I mean, world beating. Really.
And on the radio. Yeah, it's true. It's a shame. But I think it will come back round again, because I mean, it never stands still, and I think there's a real need for people to be picked up and amused now. So I think
doctors could write prescriptions for instead of depression.
Yeah, exactly.
Read comedy fiction.
Yeah, exactly.
Sort of prose. The Prozac of Prozac.
Yes.
I don't know.
Well, we have that with poetry, but we don't have that. I mean, people talk about poetry being a way of lifting your spirits because it soothes you. But actually, comedy, there's nothing like laughter.
Absolutely, no, completely. I mean, the Elizabethans. I mean, they took it really seriously in the sense that they thought you had to laugh. And that's why they employed all these jesters, because it was a medicinal thing. They really felt it was crucial to laugh, because it was, good for your health, which of course it is good for your health.
It is good for your health, exactly.
So maybe...
Maybe on the NHS. Anyway.
Well, that's brilliant. I'm going to have to bring it to a close in a minute for a change. But I just have one more question. Has anybody got something they'd like to ask, say?
The boys have been very quiet.
Yeah, the boys have been quiet. There's a lady over here. Yeah?
You spend a lot of time getting your material from observational comedy and just how people are in life. Is there anything that makes you two really howl?
Wendy makes me laugh.
Kathy makes me laugh.
But I'd also say, what really makes you? Well, I do all my research in a very in-depth scientific fashion over cappuccinos with girlfriends, and we do just laugh. So we laugh until our lips nearly fall off. And also, my best friends are comedians, Ruby Wax and Sandy Toksvig and Maureen Lipman. I mean, we've got a book club, by the way, but we only read each other's books. And we do hemorrhage hilarity at that point. So yeah, all women make
Anything makes me laugh, really, but usually really inappropriate things that are not supposed to be funny at all. So people falling over, that sort of thing.
Slapstick.
You can't be the sight gag. No.
Yeah, anything that's not supposed to happen is normally quite funny.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, but well, things that children say are quite funny too.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. Their books are both very, very funny and very worth reading. And after our next session, Wendy and Kathy will be out there signing copies of their books. So just leaves me to say, let's have a warm, warm thank you for Kathy and Wendy.
And also, thank you to Kate.
Yeah, thank you,
Kate. Brilliant, girls.
Oh no, thank you.
It'll be a quick change up, but we'll get your mics off you. Have a drink. Rather sit at the end, is that where you would rather be?
Quite near you, because otherwise I won't
Won't hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, well if I sit at the end, do you want to sit? Everybody. Actually, you haven't gone anywhere. We're the ones that have gone. So I don't know why I'm saying welcome back, but welcome again. Hello. Our final session, and it gives me huge pleasure to introduce three remarkable women. I think it would be fair to say that these three women have dared to stick their heads above the parapet in really extraordinary ways to further the interests of all women. Laura Bates studied English at Cambridge University and then became a freelance journalist. She then started, which will tell us all about this because it's a really interesting story, a website called the Everyday Sexism Project in 2012, which has become phenomenally successful throughout the world. Am I right? Yeah. Where people could post their experiences of sexism, however small or big, male or female. And she has written a book based on all the voices of the people who have filed, but also the research about the position of women today, and that's her book, Everyday Sexism, which is out there. Liz Jones needs very little introduction, I think, to all of you. She's well known as our columnist at You Magazine, where I should say she never holds back from telling us everything about her life, and she's been called the Queen of Confessional Journalism. She's the former editor of British Marie Claire and the author of books such as Liz Jones's Diary and the Exmoor Files. And her latest book, which is a very personal memoir called The Girl Least Likely To, is out in paperback, and that's outside. Vicky Price is an economist and a commentator. She was Director General for Economics at the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills, a partner and chief economist at KPMG, and joint head of the UK Government Economic Service. In 2000, she founded The Good Corporation to promote corporate social responsibility. And she's written several books, she tells me. I couldn't find them, but I do know about Greekonomics, which was a terrific book, because Vicky is Greek. You're Greek, aren't you? Yeah. Double check, I got that better. About the Greek position, which, as we know, last year was pretty tense. And then her latest book, Prisonomics, was published last year. And I think, when is it coming out in paperback? We've got a hardback.
It was probably the end of last year, so it's pretty soon it will be out.
June, yeah. And she's now a chief economist at the Centre for Business and Economic Research. So I thought I'd start with Vicky first, because your book was just such a fascinating mix of the personal and your experience in prison, and our look at a really intense cultural, social, and more importantly, economic look at how our prison system and why it fails so many people. Can you just tell us a bit what life was like for you in prison, and therefore why you wanted to write this book, what motivated it?
Well, the interesting thing I would imagine for most of you is that you probably don't know what prison is like. I had no idea what prison was going to be like, of course. Admittedly, I only spent 2 months there. So there are people who spend a lot longer there, but the average woman actually doesn't spend very long in prison at all. They go in for very trivial things. So I spent 4 days in Holloway and then nearly 2 months in an open prison, which was a revelation. So, but anyway, I had absolutely no idea what to expect. And of course I was going to a women's prison and then another women's prison, the open prison. And I think what I was struck about, first of all, was the openness of everyone there. Since we're talking about women, it's really interesting how you see immediately the solidarity that's out there, that people want to help each other. And it's not just because I was rather well known by the time I got in, because of course they had watched everything on TV. It had been going on for quite some time. They were very, very nice to me about all that. But it is because we're women. When I got into Holloway, the amazing thing is, of course, that things have changed in terms of the way you're treated. There was because of Baroness Corsten work, which was back in 2007, she looked at the conditions of women in prison, was horrified. One of the things that has stopped is strip search for women. So you entered there in a very sort of dignified way, and people were very kind, very open to you when you entered, and very helpful. Behind me came a person a woman who must have been a prostitute. Loads of them end up in prison for a short period of time. And they treated her in exactly the same way. And there was a very nice reception, which had been introduced by one of the governors who had been in Holloway before, a male governor who had been tutored by a friend of mine, which I hadn't realized until I went to prison, that this was in fact the case. Because a number of companies from the outside adopt prisons, and they spend quite a lot of time advising the governors, but also it's extraordinary how many women you find and men you find who've got something to do with prisons. They never talk about it in dinner parties, but suddenly you realize that they do spend a lot of time helping out. So going in, it was really the women and their kindness, which was extraordinary, because I do remember when I went up to my cell, I found this room which was in an absolute state, and where they were trying to get me just to spend the night, the first night. There is a sort of level A3, corridor A3 it is, by the way, in case it ever happens to any of you. And the room was freezing. It was a very, very cold. If you remember, last year it was a very cold winter. And there was no curtain, and the wind was howling through. It was quite late in the evening by the time I got there. So one poor girl, what happens in prisons is that it's the women, or the inmates, who do all the work, basically. They clean up, they look after everybody else, they serve the food, etc., etc. I don't know what the money's being spent on, but anyway, that's what happens. So one of them then got on the ledge and tried to use one of the blankets to at least use it a bit as a curtain. We failed. And so they managed to find me another room. And then he had a curtain in the other room, and it had one blanket on the bed. And I said, are there any other blankets around? And they said, we're not allowed to give you any blankets. Within 5 minutes, I had 6. Aww. They started arriving. Right. By the time the 6th one arrived, I said, I really can't take another one. 5 is enough. And they took it back. And the other thing that happens, of course, is that, someone spoke about grayling before. And of course, we do have little portable TVs in the room. And one of the girls showed me how to switch it on and so on. What tended to happen is the moment you put your kettle on, it tended to fuse the TV. So you had to be very, very careful how you did it. But the one TV wasn't working, so you could see this girl in sort of not prison clothes, because you can wear what you like, but there is a sort of uniform you can actually get, running with another TV, avoiding being seen by the guards, that she was bringing me another TV that worked in the room. So, and that continued. Wherever I went, the room where I was in, which was in the open prison, I had a lifer with me. And she looked after me so well, protected me from anyone who wanted to sell the stories to the papers, because of course they knew everything, that I played bingo, well anyway, the one thing was the women. And the second thing, of course, about the women and how, apart from being kind, they started talking to me about their stories, because I managed to get to the yard. You get half an hour of walking around. If it rains, the guards don't want to get wet, so no chance. But fortunately, it didn't rain, it was just cold. And the first day I managed to get this, there is a sort of movement that happens. You imagine yourself in a cell, someone then opens it at 7 in the morning or 8 in the morning. And then if you manage to get your breakfast, you manage to have somewhere to go to, otherwise you get locked back in again. You join the sort of movement of people who, as you go down the corridors, Holloway was built for a hospital, and it's just crazy. You go around. People would just come out and then join, and then some would peel off to the gym, some would peel off to health or the library, which I managed to get to as well. And I managed to actually get out very quickly to all these places, plus the yard. And my first day, they all sort of looked at me and then came up to me, a number of them came up to me and said, we didn't think you were going to come out here. We thought, because of who you are, you wouldn't want to mix with the rest of us. And you'd stay in yourself. Are you crazy? I said, well, why would I want to stay in myself? So the result was that they all started telling me their stories. And what was very obvious, and the reason for the book, really, is the extent to which these women were vulnerable and the way they had been treated. The fact that by the time they went into prison, they were in very many cases homeless. They had been abused as children. 53% of them had been abused as children, whether sexually, emotionally, or physically. Half of them had already suffered, because I've looked at all the statistics. I worked with the Institute of Criminology in Cambridge when I came out, and also worked with all the agencies that work on penal reform. Half of them have no qualifications when they enter prison. And the most extraordinary thing is that 31% of women who are in prison have been in care homes before. And that is immediately struck me as a completely stupid thing. Separating most of these women who all had children, the majority had children, from their families meant that their children would end up in exactly the same position, because the statistics suggest that if you grow up in a care home, not only are you very likely to be a NEET, which is not in education, employment or training, as you get older, but you're also 4 times as likely to commit some antisocial act, which includes crime. And that's basically what you perpetuate, the intergenerational thing. So first of all, they were obviously, victims already by the time they went to prison. It's extraordinary again to see the extent of drug dependence that exists. Almost half of them are drug dependent. Almost half had suffered domestic violence. A very large percentage, particularly of remand prisoners, but also of sentenced prisoners, had tried to commit suicide sometime in their lives. Had asked for mental support in the previous year, and it was, in fact, about a week after you go in is the most likely time when you try to commit suicide. And women who only represent 5% of the prison population, in fact, also account for a third of all the attempts to commit suicide or self-harm. So depression is rife, and the only way for them to survive is to talk to others and help others. And that I found, as I was saying, all across. But it is really the realization for me that these people shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
These girls should be looked after in a very different way, and also the system had failed them. It's true that it's also the case to a considerable extent for men, but most women are not violent. There are only about 100 violent women. The Holloway governor is known to have said that out of 460 women in prison, only about 60 should stay. The rest should be dealt with elsewhere. So what I did do when I started looking at the data is calculate the cost of putting women in prison. Not only the direct cost, which is huge, it's over £40,000 a year. All of us who have children who may have educated them in the private sector know that this is more expensive than the most expensive private schools. And of course, it costs a lot more for women with difficulties. It's so much cheaper to have alternatives, such as community sentencing. Keep them close to the family so the depression isn't there, and also that they can look after and reintegrate a lot more easily, look after the family, reintegrate more easily. And what's more important, in my view, is work with them to ensure that something happens with their education. So Kathy, I think, mentioned the issue about books. It's an extraordinary, stupid thing to be doing.
Yeah.
But education and employment in particular are the most important things to reduce crime overall and reduce reoffending. Reoffending costs the economy between 9 and 13 billion pounds a year. Just think of reducing that just by 10%. What difference it would make. Today we read about how little is being raised on on corporation tax from places like Amazon, who pay 4 million. We're now talking about saving billions out of doing the whole criminal justice system completely differently, which for me is absolutely essential. So I've written about alternatives, how you can actually save money, and at the end of the day, I've come to the conclusion that our criminal justice system is not fit for purpose, and that women in particular are very badly treated. I'll leave you with just one last thing. You've read recently, I'm sure, about underreported crime. We know this is the case. The police have all sorts of targets and they don't report it, and particularly rapes and violent acts against women have tended in the past not to be reported at all, not to be recorded. Underreported because women didn't think anyone would listen to them, but also not recorded by the police. And it's extraordinary what you find across England and Wales on this. But what is actually happening, because there are surveys done every year, is that crime has been declining and has halved actually in the past 20 years. And yet the number of people in prison, including women, has doubled over that period. Yeah. Crime has fallen because of technology. That's the main reason. Also because we're getting older. Also because we're getting richer. Of course, there are all sorts of crimes like fraud and so on that we don't see necessarily, but overall crime has been falling. And yet we seem to be going completely the wrong direction and spending such vast sums of money, which at the end of the day, instead of reducing reoffending and crime in society, lead to it all going up. So this is the last statistic I will finish with. But it has, though, thinking about women, it's quite an interesting thing, because before I went in, it's an interesting thought, before I went in, I really did think that maybe, feminism had won. I have changed my mind. Every article I may read now which says women have made it and anything about the glass ceiling or anything like that, and are treated equally, I now throw in the bin. I have become probably, maybe you're even more than I am, of course, yes, I've read lots of your stuff. I have become a real feminist as a result.
Good. I just wanted to ask you, because the book is an extraordinary mix of this really serious research and analysis of where our prison system is failing, but very personal stuff from your point of view. Vicky intersperses her prison diary with the research. And one of the most fascinating things, there's lots I loved about the book, was the little detail, riveting detail about as an economist, the different types of currency that really matter in prison. So for instance, I'm not sure if anybody realizes, but stamps are key currency, aren't they, in prison? Do you want to explain a bit why that? Because I thought that was, and also the cash that you took in. Tell everybody what was in your handbag.
Well, that has been written about, and I was a bit embarrassed about this.
Oh, sorry. Okay, well we won't.
No. I will say so, because actually it left me in a very good position.
Yes.
Going into prison, because having cash and being able to buy things from canteen, which includes stamps, is really, really important. I mean, I did. You probably know I had 2 trials. So every morning I would be going to Southwark Crown Court, and every second morning I think, well, maybe we'll finish quite soon, and then the jury will go off and decide whatever. And then, of course, they make a decision, and I might as well make sure that the family and the children are okay. I have 5 children myself. And so I would go to the cash machine every second day and take out 200 quid, thinking that I would leave, when it all happens, I'll be able to, someone would pay the milk, someone would have with the roof, and all sorts of things, and they would, I thought I might go away for 5 months, 6 months, who knows. So then, of course, there was a second trial. So I carried on doing this every second day. And then, of course, I was due to go and be sentenced. Now, of course, I knew that I was going to go to jail. I was absolutely convinced. And therefore, I was completely resilient, determined that I was going to survive. I had accepted it, no problem at all. I packed very sort of coolly. I thought I was in control. So then I sat that morning with all the press outside and wrote various checks for this, that, and the other, completely forgetting that my handbag was absolutely full with cash. So when I was sentenced, I went down to the cells, as they call them, but actually it was rather nice underneath, and I managed to meet my lawyers, and then the Black Maria was waiting, the Black Maria, of course, being white, I don't know why they call it that, but anyway, the transport vehicle to take me to Holloway. So they said, we've got to look at everything you've got before you go, because we need to make sure by the time you go to Holloway, everything that you've got with you comes with you, but separately. I was allowed to keep a book, pre-grailing period, with me. So then they said, right, okay, so what have you got in here? You've got a comb, you've got what else have you got? And they started taking out this money. So, oh my God, you've got another 20, let's see. Now, so it carried on for quite some time, to the point where they started calling everybody else around. Hey, Fred, come and have a look at this handbag. So all the guard, the people from the Serco and so on who look after these things, sort of came round, and they were having a real laugh. Actually, it was very relaxing. It was really nice for me. I was about to go to jail, and we were all laughing together. And then they counted it, because we've also found some coins. They ended up being £1,490. And the good thing is, of course, that I used a lot of it for phones. So phones and stamps. Now, why stamps? I mean, of course, we all know, as economists, that, and we also know, because we probably all have read about these things, that cigarettes used to be currency in prisoner of war's camp. you know, this is basically what they were all able to change for other services they wanted. Was stamps for women. I mean, they can now get cigarette. You know, they all rolled their tobacco. That was quite easy. But stamps were the most important thing because women need to keep in touch with their children. And you have phones. BT charges an extortionate amount to use the phone that's there. We all queue and we hear them all crying, talking to the children. Oh. But it's very expensive. Stamps are important. And so I was able not only to buy them and distribute them, which apparently I shouldn't have done, so don't tell anyone, but also I told everybody to send me stamps. And I have to admit that despite me trying very, very hard to distribute as many as I could, I still brought so many stamps, they're probably going to last me my life, because everyone was sending me stamps. And then I heard that actually in a number of places they weren't allowing stamps in that people were sending, because it's a bit like the books, the excuse for the books, which is that, you know, you can put drugs behind it, LSD. So when you are, you know, sort of licking them, although you don't need to lick them these days, you just stick them. They can have drugs at the back. But given that, if you know the statistics, I did say that drug addiction is really rife. I mean, people arrive, you know, already sort of off their head. But 20% of women who have been to prison, who have tried heroin, tried it in prison first. So, you know, it goes in through guards, you know, accepting payment, not through books and through stamps. So it's a ridiculous idea. And I told this to a number of charities, and they've really pushed hard on the stamp side to ensure that those prisons that were not allowing them in now do.
I thought that was just the most riveting detail, that, you know, stamps, because women wanted to write to their children and their families, just actually makes me almost want to cry right now. We'll come back to you again in a minute, Vicky, but Liz, I wanted to talk to you about your book. Your memoir was so painful. Liz needs me to shout, is that right? Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yeah,
she's a bit deaf on one side, so your questions later I might have to repeat. So tell me if you don't hear anything. It's so painfully honest, I wanted to hug you. I just thought you needed a big hug all the way through. You were the youngest of 7. And how was that for you? Tell us a bit what that was like and what your family life was like, because you write so powerfully about your parents.
Well, being the youngest of 7, it was very chaotic. My brothers and sisters didn't really want much to do with me because I was so much younger than them. And all I saw really was my mum constantly doing housework, so cleaning, cooking. We never had any money. We never even had milk. She used to dilute the milk half and half with water to make it go further. By Friday, we always ran out of food. She didn't have a car. She had to get the bus. So being part of that big family, it made me very protective of my things and my space, because so now if anyone moves something or doesn't put things in the fridge without, you know, I'm very, very OCD about stuff because there were so many of us. I had to protect my little patch. And it also made me not want to have the life that my mum had then. But now, having sort of come full circle and just worked and thinking about a career, and I didn't have children, I kind of envy her life in a way now, because she had a man who loved her for 50 years, and how many of us had that, really? So, and what I've discovered, and my book is about working in fashion for sort of 31 years, is that your job doesn't love you back. And at the end, I think I wrote about this last Sunday, I said, you know, women work so hard, but do beware that you don't end up with nothing, because I've seen that happen to my sisters, it's happened to me. I think we've all been hoodwinked in a way. I mean, my book's mainly about fashion and being hoodwinked by fashion, and I would look at a picture. I knew when my eating disorder really took off as I saw a picture of Debbie Dickinson, who's Janice Dickinson's sister, who's a big supermodel, eating watermelon on a yacht. And I thought, I'm going to do that. If I eat watermelon, I didn't have the yacht, I'm going to have her life. Because I believed what was in the photographs. I believed that she had an amazing life. Then when I worked in fashion, I realised it was all an illusion, and actually the models had thread veins, crusty feet, acne, heroin problem, boyfriends who beat them up. So it was quite a shock to discover that world of fashion wasn't as perfect. So yeah, it's been a disappointing life in lots of ways, because all my illusions were sort of shattered. I'll find a man who loves me. I'll live happily ever after. And I think I was me and my sisters were the first generation of women who grew up wanting careers. I was born in 1958. My sisters were born sort of earlier than me. They came of age in the 60s. I feel in lots of ways that feminism and having it all has let us down, because my mum had a happier life than we did, much more secure, not always panicking, worried. I mean, my sister in Australia wrote me a letter the other day, and she won't mind me saying it, asking me for £300 to pay her electricity bill. And she's worked as an intensive care nurse for 20 odd years, and she also has nothing. So you think, why are we doing this? So hopefully my book could be a bit of a warning thing to women, young women, find out about money, get a pension, really look after yourself, because there is no one to look after us.
You write, and that's why I wanted to hug her all the way through, you can tell. You write also very powerfully about your childhood, about how you were scared of things all the time, and you suffered a really, we'll come on to this with Laura, Laura's book is full of the types of assaults that you suffered at primary school, and how that made you scared, really, of men and boys. Was that the root of the scaredness, or?
Well, I didn't know. I mean, in primary school, yes, I was sort of abused by a fellow pupil, but I didn't realise until I had therapy just a few years ago that might have been the root of the problem. It probably, like, fashion didn't contribute to my anorexia and being sectioned and hospitalised and fed through a tube. It's part of it. So I think that abuse was part of it. I also had a mum who was very protective, very scared. I mean, I never had ambitious parents, helicopter parents. All my mum wanted was for me not to be run over. That was it. And if I'd survived to adulthood, that would be fine. But I don't know what my fear of men was. I mean, I didn't have sex with a man until I was 32, because I just didn't feel ready. Next month, when I reach 8 stone 2, when I bought those Calvin Klein shorts, when I've got a lovely house, when I've had my lawn returfed, when I've got a nice car, I was never ready, because I thought you had to be perfect to have sex.
Which is a real thing that I think women struggle with. I mean, it's very powerful the way you write about that in the memoir. The sort of struggle for perfection that you felt that you had to achieve, and I think that's something that's reminiscent for a lot of women.
I was part of that industry, being editor of Marie Claire magazine. I encouraged women to be unhappy with what they had, and in order to buy stuff, you have to feel bad about yourself. Because if everything's going well, you don't need the new handbag, you don't need the Medi-Spa, you don't need the facelift or the cream. So it was my job as an editor to make women feel bad about themselves, and I just thought, I'm not comfortable with this, because I know it's bankrupted me and it's made me unhappy. So I started to question why I was part of that industry. So while I was editor of Marie Claire, I started writing in Marie Claire, stupidly, and also in the Daily Mail, about all the tricks of the trade and the fact that if you don't put a Natalie Portman in Armani, you get this really cross fax from Giorgio Armani saying, you editor, if you don't put my clothes on the celebrity that I'm happy with, we're going to withdraw the advertising. And they used to count all the points, so a cover was 10 points, a catwalk picture was 2 points. I published a piece about the Chanel having this sort of deer musk, pulled their advertising. I put a bigger woman on the cover, they pulled their advertising. I put an older woman on the cover, almost, although I was stopped. Sade, who at 42 was beautiful, our most successful pop singer. She sells more records than Adele. Wasn't allowed to put a 42-year-old woman on the cover. I mean, it is changing a bit now, but then you could not put a bigger woman or a woman over the age of 42 on your cover because it was just suicide.
And you really stuck your neck out, didn't you, in that industry with the
Well, yeah, but I wasn't a very good at it. Well, then I was sacked, so I couldn't carry on. It was a bit stupid to try and change the industry from that position. It was just stupid, but I didn't have a choice.
I admire
really.
you for trying. I don't think it was stupid. I think it was brave. But I just wanted to finish and then I'll go on to Laura, because I started watching, because I work for you and you're Liz. I started watching you on CBB, the Celebrity Big Brother. I don't know however many other people did, but I was absolutely riveted by you on it. I thought you were... I
don't know why, though.
I just completely fell in love with you on it. I thought you were so funny and you were so yourself, and I don't ever watch that programme. But there was one thing that you said when you came out, which I thought was really interesting. You said you wanted to be happier from now on. You said, I'm going to try and enjoy my life rather than endure it. And I just wanted to ask whether you'd managed that.
Well, you see, they asked me year after year after year after year, and I do get asked a lot of things, but I'm not very comfortable being on telly. I mean, I never look in the mirror. I mean, when I came out and Emma showed me my highlights, I was like, I just couldn't watch them. I'm very phobic about watching myself and the mirror and everything. So I did try to come out. I don't know if I'm really allowed to say it, but I did try to come out of it and think, right, a full stop, let's start again, I'm back on track financially. Yeah. But then I had a big blow the day after I came out, so I wasn't back on track financially. I'm not really allowed to talk about it.
No, right, okay. So I still got to hug you.
Everyone in there kept trying to hug me and high-five me, and I'm like, don't touch me.
Okay, we'll come back to you again in a minute. Now, Laura, you are amazing. Your Everyday Sexism project, I have to say that my daughters, my youngest daughter, who's at Oxford, heard you come to speak, and that was how I found out about you, and I could not believe that you are such an inspiration to young women. This is the younger generation of feminism, folks. Here she is. She set up, tell us what happened to you and why you set up the Everyday Sexism project.
It really came completely out of the blue for me. I was actually working as an actress, by which I mean that I was going to lots of auditions and not getting parts and working as a nanny, because that is largely what being an actress means. And I started to realise that I would go to an audition and you get these casting breakdowns that tell you what they're looking for in the role. And my boyfriend was an actor as well, so we'd both get these breakdowns. And his casting breakdowns would say things like, the character's an architect, and this is the sort of relationships he has, and he's quite pensive, and he's a family sort of oriented person, and he's shy in these situations but gregarious in these situations, and this is his backstory. And my casting breakdowns would say 32 double D. And that would be it. Or occasionally something about how small the waist was. So there was a royal, but then we would also kind of say things that were really hilariously contradictory. Like I had one genuinely once that said, it was something like, she's a virgin, she's very virginal and naive, yet fuckable. Or it would be like, you know, she's a vixen, but she's an angel. And these like really stereotypical kind of sexualized ideas of the character. So even before you went in, you'd been kind of positioned in this incredibly kind of unrealistic way. And then you go into the auditions, and I was waiting for an audition one day, and I probably shouldn't say the name of the company, but it was an advert for a wardrobe. And I was in the audition room for about 15 minutes waiting, during which time anyone could have come and talked things through with me, but they didn't. And just as I was about to walk in and I'd learned my lines, and you know, when you're an actor, adverts, commercials are very lucrative, so you really desperately need those jobs to help pay the bills. And I was really kind of, you know, really prepared. And just as I was about to walk in, someone came over to me and said, "Oh, by the way, love, we've decided to sex it up a bit, and now you're taking your top off." And it wasn't, we'd like to discuss this, or would you consider? It was just, you're taking your top off, you know, this is just the way it was. And I was torn between part of me kind of going off and that, and then a part of me, a little voice in my head that was just going, for a wardrobe. So I was already kind of moving down that road, I think, and then because I would go to those auditions and then I'd go and pick up from school the children I was nannying and looking after to pay the bills, and I'd find that the boys were kind of running around off doing everything I'd expected them to, and the girls, even really young girls, aged 9 or 10, were talking about thunder thighs and pushing their pasta around their plate because they'd heard it, pasta makes you fat, and they wouldn't eat it, and I kind of felt like I was starting to see a real cause and effect. But even then, it still kind of didn't quite, sort of, the penny didn't quite drop. And then what happened was that just over 2 years ago, I had just a really bad week or two where a series of things, just by pure coincidence, all happened within a really short space of time. So I was on the bus one day, and as I got off the bus, a man jumped up. Obviously, it wasn't his stop, followed me off the bus, followed me all the way home, really aggressively sexually propositioning me, trying to grab me, trying to hold my hand, saying he was coming home with me, refusing to take no for an answer. And I had to walk past my house and pretend I was going somewhere else, and I actually ran into the supermarket and rang a friend to come and kind of pick me up. And then I was on the bus one night, and I was on the way home, and it was quite late at night, and I was on the phone to my mum, and I thought the man next to me just accidentally brushed my leg with his hand. And then gradually, as I carried on talking, realised he was actually groping his way up my leg towards my crotch. And I stood up and I moved away from him, and because I was on the phone, I was in that sort of bubble where I don't think I otherwise would have felt able to say what happened. But because I was on the phone, I said, I'm on the bus, this man's just groped my legs. And everyone on that bus heard me, and everyone on the bus looked out the window. Everybody looked away, no one stepped in, but even more than that, there was this real sense of, you know, don't bring this into the public domain, woman, this is a woman thing, deal with it, you know, and it made me feel really embarrassed and ashamed and sort of fearful and like I shouldn't have been there, and basically all the emotions the perpetrator deserved to feel in that situation, I felt. And then a few days later, I was on my way home, and I was walking through a kind of leafy street in the middle of the afternoon, and there was a truck with some scaffolding on the back that was being offloaded, and 2 guys working together. And as I walked past, within literally a metre of them, one of them just turned to the other, looked me up and down, and said, "Look at the tits on that." Not even her, just that. And so what suddenly hit me at the end of this period of time was that I started thinking about all these things. And I suddenly realised if any one of them had happened in isolation, I never would have thought twice about any of them, because it was so normal. And it made me start thinking about how many of these things had happened. I can see nods all around the room. Yes, how, you know, when you start thinking back, you remember so many of these occasions. And the incredible thing is that I'd never told anyone about any. I just shrugged it off and carried on home and got on with it like you do, because it was just sort of the way things were. So I started wondering why it was that I was so used to this, and I started talking to other women and saying, hey, you know, have you ever experienced anything like this? Not necessarily in the street, but maybe at work or at university or whenever. And I honestly thought that a few people would say, oh yeah, I once had this thing, you know, 5 years ago this happened, or I had a job once where this incident happened. And what actually happened wasn't like that at all. It took me completely by surprise. It was every woman I spoke to. And it wasn't one incident 5 years ago. It was like, well, yeah, on my way to meet you today, this happened. And yesterday, this happened. And, you know, I spoke to a woman who worked in the city, and she said, yeah, well, the guys in my office will go to a strip club at lunchtime, and sometimes they'll entertain clients there, so I'll miss out on those deals. One woman told me that when people were coming in to be interviewed for new positions in her firm, the guys in the office would print out the pictures of their resumes and hold them up across the room and rate them out of 10. And the stories would just kept coming and coming and coming. And so I tried to start talking about it because I felt like I was seeing this kind of mosaic almost spreading out like a map. And just like me, so many of them said, gosh, you know, until you asked me, I've never actually told anyone any of these things. So I started trying to speak up about it. And I just got this brick wall of, no, sexism doesn't exist anymore. Women are equal now, you know, it's not a problem. And people said, you know, you must be making a fuss, or they meant it as a compliment, you know, you need to get a sense of humour, all of these things. And that's why I started the project, because I wanted other people to have that experience I'd had of going, wow, look at these stories together, and you realise this is still a massive problem.
And you were overwhelmed, weren't you? You were surprised yourself by the numbers of things. I mean, tell us just a little bit, just so that people get a feel of kind of some of the most shocking stories, really, that shocked you.
I was completely overwhelmed. I didn't have any way of advertising the project or funding for it, so I thought maybe 20 or 30 people would add stories. In reality, it's been running for 2 years now. We've had 60,000 stories from people all over the world, from a 7-year-old girl in a wheelchair and a 74-year-old woman in a mobility scooter who sent in almost an identical story about screamed abuse about female drivers, from a reverend in the Church of England who was asked if there was a man available constantly to perform the wedding or the funeral, you know, nothing personal. A midwife who was regularly sexually assaulted by a senior male colleague, a city worker who was told to sit on her boss's lap if she wanted her Christmas bonus, countless schoolgirls as young as 8 or 9 saying that when they were in their school uniform, it was just normal that people would shout stuff about their chests, stuff about wanting to sleep with them, girls talking about boys at school, touching them against their will, about hearing stuff in the classroom like rape as a compliment really, girls at universities experiencing severe harassment, not just out clubbing or in the street, but in the lecture halls or universities, women in the workplace experiencing overt pregnancy discrimination, being told you're a maternity risk, we won't give you that promotion, waitresses being told when they became pregnant, well, you can have a simple choice here, have an abortion or you're fired. It just went on and on and on. And we heard from women who were experiencing kind of double forms of discrimination as well, disabled women who were being told, you know, if you're just going to sit there, you might as well get your breasts out. Black women who were experiencing kind of slurs, racial slurs about being spicy and exotic. It was just immensely, it was enormous. And then within a few months, we started getting these entries that were coming in from all over the world. We heard from a girl in Pakistan who talked about hiding sexual abuse for the sake of family honor. A woman in Argentina who tried to ignore the 4 men catcalling her from a car only to find that they screeched to a halt and tried to drag her in. A woman in I think in Mexico, whose university professor told her in a lecture in front of everyone, "Calladita te ves más bonita," you look prettier when you shut up. 2 girls in France, aged 12 and 16, who were having a picnic in a public park when a man came and masturbated over them. A woman in India who was too afraid to report the man with the erect penis pressed into her back on the bus. And the amazing thing was that the same stories were coming in from women everywhere, all over the world, echoing and overlapping and repeating each other.
I mean, what strikes me, I think it's just, I'm so sort of thrilled to have you 3 here, because it's such different walks of life, but all actually saying the same thing about women, which is one that if this was any other sector of society, if this was a racial, if we were talking about these things, you know, all of the things you've described about, you know, a particular nationality or about, you know, black men, say, there would be an outcry. It would not be, it would be clearly wrong. Yet somehow, when all these kind of injustices involve women, it's hidden. That's the one thing I wanted you all to comment on. And then the other thing is this notion that somehow we can't stand up and say no, you know, that we can't, what is it that holds us back from actually trying to stand up against it in a way that you 3 have? Do you want to, does that give us enough to talk about, I think, before I open it up?
Can I just say one thing? I mean, it's extraordinary what you've been saying. Of course, we, you know, having children, I'm aware of some of these things. Plus, we all grew up in a certain way. But it's interesting about the criminal justice system and women, and how they feel they've been treated by it. Because the general belief says there is a bias. So if you're a woman, just taking that, you know, your stories a bit further, you're generally supposed to be the sort of fairer sex, not say anything, and just look good and smile and so on and so forth. So if you do something bad, it's commit a crime of some sort, however trivial it might be, which is against your supposed nature, then you're perceived to be really bad.
Yes.
And not only are you likely, which people say is the case, one needs to prove it scientifically, to possibly get a worse sentence than a man for whatever it is that you did. But the more important thing, even if we eliminate that, is the way you're treated by the media for having been a woman who's done something wrong. It gets hugely sensationalized. And the thing is that for a number of women who have to go back to their community, if you look at local press and regional press and what it means for their sleepy town, say, if they've done something, whereas it would be completely acceptable for a boy to misbehave, they find it then incredibly, they say that the day of sentencing, what the judge said was the worst thing about the whole thing. Because now I can't go back. And yet women have to go back. The vast majority of women, I mean, of course, loads of them lose their homes. It's the worst thing. I was listening to what you were saying about being brought up. It is extraordinary that 40% of women who leave prison have got nowhere to go because they've lost their homes. Can you imagine looking after children who've already been moved out of your home because, you know, possibly into care and so on. So they are not mobile women as they are men. Men can then leave prison and go somewhere else and work. And they do that because they have no real attachments. It's a huge number of single mothers who go to, a third of the women who go to prison with children are single mothers, which is an extraordinary percentage, really. And the most extraordinary statistics are that if a man goes to prison, then the child stays in the home because someone else looks after them. If a woman goes to prison, only 5% of children stay in their homes, which is an extraordinary thing to have. So there is already, you know, an impact on just being a woman, and the different treatment that's out there. And that's another thing that actually struck me. That's why I focus very much on the women's plight in this. It's a slightly different take on this. But of course, a number of the women who end up in prison are, as I mentioned, prostitutes already, but human trafficking. It's extraordinary how many of them are one encounters who have been, for some reason, they're the ones who've been penalised for having been trafficked. And then the mules, I met a number of them. There were a couple who had done it as a business from the Caribbean, I have to admit. But many of the others, and that's what the evidence says, do it because the men threaten their families. So they're forced to do it. So that continues. And finally, in terms of being abused as children and so on, which I already mentioned, you know, abuse at home and so on that happens, and domestic violence, a huge percentage of women. But what is also sort of really extraordinary about the entire affair is the huge percentage then of the difficulties that these women encounter whether they come out, because, as I said at the beginning, they try and get a job when they return. Everyone in the neighbourhood, because they have nowhere else to go really in many ways, everyone in the neighbourhood will already know about this. The chances of them being rehabilitated in the way that we'd like them rehabilitated evaporate because of the way they've already been treated. And there is huge difference also depending on which bit of England or Wales you're in. There are particular counties in England where a woman is 4 times more likely to be sent to prison than another county. And so you just haven't got a clue. And what happens finally is, this is a woman with a child, okay, with children. 50% of the women who are sentenced to go to prison go to sentencing day not expecting to be sentenced to prison. So they go unprepared. They've left the children with a neighbour saying, I'm going to come back this evening and pick them up. Because the probation officer says they shouldn't be sent to prison because of the children, the solicitor says they shouldn't, and yet they are. You can see what that means then for whoever it is that they leave behind, and for them as well. So I think you're absolutely right. We all were lulled into thinking that things have changed, but actually the prejudice against women remains.
Liz, do you think?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you a question, really. Am I allowed to do that?
Yes, of course you are.
How do you think we can progress? Because all the recent trials and cases, and what's really come up is that all these women didn't report what happened to them at the time. And so there's sort of initiatives to get people to speak up and put men on trial and everything. But surely the answer is to ask why men do this in the first place. And because it's too late then, isn't it, once they're encouraged to write about it or report it to the police? Why is it happening in the first place? How do we take that away? Is it purely because, I don't think it is really purely because it's such a sexualized society and there's Beyonce and there's videos and there's, because I don't think abuse isn't about that, is it? It's not about how attractive you are. It can happen to an 83-year-old, it can happen to a 5-year-old. So how do we change and stop men wanting to do that? Or are we never going to stop them? We just have to put up all these portcullises and...
Well, that's a huge question. I believe really firmly that we have to be pragmatic and attack things from all different angles. I think you're absolutely right about the social acceptability of sexism. I think it's dangerous perhaps to compare it to other forms of prejudice, which are also still huge problems like racism. But I do think that we need to try and have a cultural shift in the way that we talk about women, the way we express misogyny so publicly and so acceptably. I think that children, I think we have to look at sex and relationships education, because you're right, you know, preventative measures are so important, although I wouldn't replace the initiatives, you know, encouraging people to come forward. I think we need that as well, because a huge problem is that we still stigmatise victims, we still blame victims, we still spout nonsense about women wearing short skirts having anything to do with rape, even though the figures show time and again that that's got nothing, there is no correlation there. We do have to focus on perpetrators, you're right. And one way that I really think we could make strides forward would be if we had stuff in the classroom, really relatively simple stuff. There is nothing compulsory on our national curriculum to say that children in classrooms need to learn about consent and what it means, or about healthy relationships, or about abuse. And then against that backdrop, I get emails from, I had one just the other day, and it said, "My name's Nicola, I'm 13 years old, and I'm so scared to have sex, I cry nearly every night." And she went on to explain that a boy in her class had shown her a mobile phone video of what she described as sex. She didn't use the word porn, she thought it was sex. And she said, "I just didn't realise that when you have sex, the woman has to be crying and hurting." And, you know, I'm not suggesting for one moment that online porn is the root of all evil, but our young people, boys and girls, are being bombarded with these messages from all around them about the roles of men and women and about the way that men and women should interact. And we know they're experiencing that. The question is, do we want to give them the tools to deal with it? Do we want to talk to them in the classroom about consent and about respect and gender equality and healthy relationships? And it baffles me that the government thinks that composting needs to be on the curriculum, but we don't need to know about these issues, you know? Whichever way you approach it from, you can take a very hard-nosed economic perspective and look at the billions of pounds cost to the economy every year by domestic violence, you know, or you can look at the fact that 750,000 children live in homes where they witness domestic violence every year. We can't trust that this will be happening in the home, and we could so easily give some of those vital tools at such a young age.
Exactly, because there's this incredible irony that, as Vicky has said, more women get sentences for trifling crimes compared to men. There are lots of women in prison who are, you know, who shouldn't be there. But then women are also the victims of domestic abuse, you know, murdered 2 a week, whatever it is, you know, all of that goes unreported, let alone dismissal for pregnancy, as you've talked about, and all those other issues that are criminal, actually. It's an offence.
And it's so connected, I think. There are so many of these different issues going on. And I think whether you're looking at the objectification of women in the media and as we were saying, the portrayal of women in the media as kind of sex subjects first and foremost, regardless of whether they're a politician. You know, Theresa May makes a speech and we hear about her shoes, not what policies she talked about. I think these things are all connected. So I think we have to also take the kind of more minor things seriously, because those ideas and attitudes, if we allow them to perpetuate, also are at the root of the more serious offences.
And we have to believe that we have a right to say all of those things and not be belittled. Okay, this is fascinating. I could talk for hours. Questions? Are there questions? Loads of questions. Yes, good. Two over there. Oh, Tanya. Yeah.
Hello. Ladies, I'm Professor Tanya Byron. I spoke this morning, but I stayed all the way to the end to see you three women who I respect hugely. I'm really interested in what you say. I just want to make a couple of comments. I work in child and adolescent mental health. Liz, I actually don't agree with some of what you said. I'm a full-time working mother. I've got teenage children, and I'm really happily married. And I think women can have it all, and some of us are actually. I don't think it's an all or nothing. And I'm sorry that you feel that you didn't achieve that, but I think a lot of women do, and I worry about the polarisation of the argument sometimes. And in a sense, I wanted to talk about the polarisation of the argument we're having now, because a lot of sexism exists because a lot of women perpetuate it and buy into it, and I'm just a little bit worried that we're sort of sounding like we're saying we're a victim gender, and to a large degree we are. I work in clinical services with children and women who are raped and abused hugely, but I also think that a lot of women buy into it. A lot of women edit magazines, a lot of women produce television programs, and I think it's more complicated than that. And I just wanted to say that, particularly as the mother of a son, who I think also as a young man has quite a tough time growing up in the world where the world is feminised and boys can't be male. So I really respect what you're saying. I just wanted to add a slightly different perspective to it as well. Thank you.
Someone over there.
I think some of the maybe the more what we might call minor incidents that happen to us are maybe there's a tendency for women to go into shock, particularly when these everything's happen on an everyday basis, like, you know, just even somebody shouting to you, or I had an incident where somebody came up behind me on a tube and shoved me, you know, did the penis thing and shoved me onto the tube. And I sat there in shock. And I think that took away my ability to deal with it. And I wondered if it actually happened. So I sat there just sort of thinking, did this guy just do this? Did he do it? And I think maybe as women, it's more difficult for us to get aggressive, perhaps because we're afraid of the consequences. If I had got aggressive, what might he have done? You know, would other people have come to help me? I don't know. But I'd certainly think there's a shock element that you go into sometimes when these things happen, and that makes it more difficult to deal with, and even to report it afterwards. Sometimes when it's, you know, maybe that's a relatively minor incident, people might say, would you go to the police and pursue it? You know, they would never find this chap, he was on a tube. And I think there's a lot of that goes on, just everyday incidents, and women are just in so much shock, you don't know how to deal with it.
Do anybody want to? Was that a question, or do you want to answer that, or are you?
I just want to say that that's an incredibly common thing, that we have so many people report really, really similar things to the project. They say, I thought I'd do this, or I thought I'd do that, and then in the moment I was frozen, and that it is such a natural reaction. And really that's why I think we can't focus on saying the victim should this, that, or the other. It has to be about trying to stop it happening in the first place. It has to be about encouraging bystanders to step in, encouraging society to send a message, this isn't acceptable. And also there are so many different ways of looking at it. You know, it's possible to report that kind of thing after the fact if you feel able to. But you know, the fact that people feel able to stand up and that we are now shouting about this is strong. You know, I don't buy into it. I think it's a straw man argument that this is somehow making us all victims. This is something that's been going on for years, and women today are now standing up and shouting back about it.
I didn't say that. I just said we need to nuance the discussion slightly more, and that women buy into this. Some women actually perpetuate this as well. So
that's all right. I didn't mean to. Just, you mentioned a class of victims, and I hear that argument a lot. And the thing is, I find it very strong that women are speaking out about these issues now and standing up. You know, I think that being a victim is when you're silenced and you don't feel able to. So, you know, I'm really pleased that we're having these conversations and speaking out.
One thing, I mean, it's really interesting what was said in the comment, because of course, while I was inside, lots of people had wrote about me. And we talked about misogynism earlier, or at least it wasn't quite that, it was a different word, about marriage. But it was extraordinary how many of the women, including Liz, who wrote very negative things about me were women. How many of the writers were women. And that was very, 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 very surprising to me.
Wendy?
I had a question for Laura, which was, how's your research and your project changed your view of men? I mean, do you have anything positive to say about men? Has it made you feel that men are just all terrible? I mean, how it must have affected the way you see them. So would you like to tell us about that?
Not for one moment. I mean, right from the beginning, in everything I've written and everything I've done about the project, we've made it really clear that this wasn't about women against men. It wasn't about vilifying men. It's obviously far more complex than that. A huge number of the stories we get are about women perpetuating sexism, as has just been mentioned. A lot of them are from men experiencing gender inequality, men in the office, for example, being ridiculed for asking for parental leave. And a huge amount of the support we've had has been from men who are equally fed up of this and standing up to it, especially young men. There's a real backlash going on at universities from young men saying this is outrageous. So, you know, I've tried to be very clear all the way along that this isn't really a men versus women issue at all. It's more about people standing against prejudice. And I think that what it's really shown from the project specifically is that it isn't a case really of men dealing with a set of things over here and women dealing with a separate set. It's more that the same central gender stereotypes, whether it's ideas about women needing to look after the children and men going out to work, or whatever else, whether it's about women kind of being quiet and retiring and men being strong and macho, are having negative impacts on both men and women, and that therefore it has to be something that we all stand up to together because it's in all of our benefits to do so.
Another, Kathy? Let's take a reader and then Kathy and then someone over here. Yeah?
There's a lady behind her.
Okay. You're going to go first, yeah?
Sorry. I'd just like to say, because I worked with children for a long time, I'd like to say that, yes, the system is all wrong in many respects, and I think to work with children in a capacity where we learn to be strong from the inside out. It's all very well to talk and talk and talk, and this is all enlightening, but I think we need to start with ourselves. And I think women, you know, it can be something as simple as learning how to do some martial arts. And, you know, you see children that are actually taught to focus and taught not to live all up here, but to live from the inside out, to be strong. And if you've had an experience which are devastating, you go one way or the other. But we have to start with the young, and we have to start with not so much cerebral. We're really good at that in the Western world. Let's start working with the heart and working with the strength inside. When you're very strong inside, there's a lot of stuff that can happen, and I'm not saying victimization can't happen, but I'm saying you can deal with it in a more positive way. That's my take on the thing.
There's a lady over there, yeah, and then Kathy.
What I want to say is a little bit relating to this lady, what she said over here. When I was young, I spent a lot of time dodging the old octopus arms, and we just thought you just had to dodge them. You never said a thing to anybody in the offices or anything, you just dodged and knew you had to. But I think things are changing because I have got three daughters in my 20s, and not one of them would put up with what you put up with. I would have, and would still. But I think things are changing because I know my daughters now would just turn round and would just do something about the situation there and then. Girls today are not prepared, I don't think, to put up with what we put up with 20, 30 years ago, which is why I think a lot of people are saying, why are they bringing all this stuff up from the 80s? But people our age are just realising now, actually, that was wrong, and we shouldn't have been dodging those octopus arms. And the girls today, I don't think, are prepared because they've got a voice, and they're prepared to stand up and say, "Get your filthy hands off me." So I just admire girls today. They're much stronger, and I think they've got, you know, more of a handle on it.
You've been a good mum, clearly. Okay, Kathy. And then we're going to have to break. I think this. I think I'm going to have to end with Kathy because otherwise, people have got trains.
No, I was just going to say, I think what we need to do too is get men really involved in the feminist campaign. I mean, all the men here, of course, are love gods because you wouldn't be here if you weren't feminist. And in the civil rights movement, there were black faces as well as white faces campaigning. But I feel we've been campaigning the feminists for all our rights for so long without men right there beside us, not tolerating that behaviour from other blokes. And we need your strength with us. But what we have learnt from all of this is that it is still a man's world. In Britain, we're only getting 75 pence in the pound. We're still getting concussion hitting our head on the glass ceiling, and we're supposed to clean it while we're up there. So basically, to round up the day, I would say any woman who calls herself a post-feminist has kept her wonder bra and burnt her brains, because we've still got a long way to go.
Okay, I think I'm going to have to stop it there. It's been a wonderful afternoon. I want to thank you all. I want to, just before I thank our three wonderful speakers here, I want to tell you that their books are out there. They're here to sign. I'm sure we can carry on this conversation for hours. Thank you all for coming, but most particularly thank you to Laura Bates, Vicky Price, and our wonderful Liz Jones.
This is it. But before you all dash off for the book signing, I have one more thank you to make, and I'd like to say thank you so much to Kate, not only for organising today, but facilitating the whole event so beautifully. I'm Catherine Fenton. I'm the Deputy Editor of You Magazine, and I hope you'll agree that today has been most entertaining, thought-provoking, and just a very, very successful afternoon. So thank you all for coming. I hope you've all enjoyed it as much as I have, and please get book signing. Thank you.
For me? Oh, it's so sweet. It's amazing.